Welcome to Layer 03 of the first serial experiment. We would like to recommend that you partake in this experiment with headphones on and the video set to full screen. Please enjoy.
Exactly as tired as you may have remembered me from last.
And of course, everybody immediately wanted to know the
Seconds
opposite.
later. It's a fucking
The top 10 best legendary Pokemon.
There is the famous anecdote about the American soldier who had a metal plate put into his skull after receiving a shrapnel wound to the head during the Vietnam War. He was later distressed when the metal began acting as antennae, plaguing him with radio signals that resonated inside his head. Hearing radio waves is a common auditory hallucination among patients with schizophrenia. There also seem to be many cases in which the patient feels that he has been bugged and is being monitored. However, it is also true that bugging and surveillance devices are indeed being sold in immense numbers for a variety of illegal uses and intentions, and that specialists in the locating and removal of such hidden devices do exist. Information in the brain is relayed through weak electrical pulses that run between the synapses, and in the world in which we live, countless radio waves fly through the air and a profusion of electromagnetic waves leak continually from the many wires crisscrossing above our heads. It would be unwise to jump to any conclusions from the casual connection of these aforementioned points. However, it is necessary for us to recognize that the environment in which we live is a dangerous one. Foucault's theory on madness is so fascinating because he relates that the root cause of every madness can be reduced to an individual. However, if there exists a communicable madness among humans, its purpose must be to minimize the negative effect of a system component it considers defunct, simplifying the charted route to madness in order to expedite the breakdown of such a component. In other words, there exists some unknown external force seeking the change and control of humans, which must necessarily be classified as a phenomena separate from madness. If such a process as the one here described of the purposeful systemized metabolism of human consciousness is possible, then it may already be at work. If so, who is behind it?
Distortion. Layer 05.
To understand episode 5, I think it's important that we first talk about H.P. Lovecraft. One of the most famous and influential horror authors of all time, the type of stories that he wrote have become synonymous with his name, and the mythological creatures which he created have been built upon by over a century's use by other authors, generating the Cthulhu mythos. The basic idea of Lovecraftian horror is that humanity is insignificant in the grand scheme of the cosmos, and the universe is filled with things so far beyond our comprehension that a person might descend into madness at the mere sight of them. Characters in Lovecraft stories would often stumble randomly onto something completely alien, which would instantly destroy their mind or change them fundamentally forever. Chiaki Kanaka, the writer of serial experiments Lain, started off writing Cthulhu mythos stories. In this episode, Lain's sister Mika plays the role of a Lovecraftian victim. In one fateful moment, without her even realizing what's going on, her consciousness becomes desynchronized. Somehow, a version of herself materializes in the Wired, separate from the self that has been left behind in the physical world. Mika's separation is so violent and she is so unprepared for it that one could miss how it is prophetic of the eventual change that will occur in Lain. The idea of leaving the physical world behind to have an existence in the Wired is that you would create a version of yourself existing solely in the Wired and then kill your physical self. However, if your physical self exists in parallel with a version that exists only in the Wired, then those selves could be split. If Lain's wired consciousness can persist without the presence of her physical self, then it can also have its own experiences and develop separately. This episode gives us the first hints that the intentions of physical Lain and wired Lain may be separating. By now, we are beginning to challenge the notion that leaving your physical body and going to the Wired is actually the transformation that the voices of the Wired have been trying to sell us, and not actually an abandonment of one individual. This episode tosses a lot of technical suppositions our way. The art book quote and some of the faces that Lain learns from in this episode posit how the electromagnetic waves constantly surrounding us and the layering of the Wired over the physical world may be entwined with the electrical synapses which cause our thoughts. In other words, if thought is nothing but the computing of electrical signals, then it is no different from the actions of a computer. And as the world becomes more and more wired, the human brain becomes intimately intertwined with the electrical layer overlaying our world. Therefore, as our brains are exposed to the electrical signals in the air, our thoughts are fundamentally distorted. Episode 6 marks a pretty huge shift in tone from the previous episodes. Whereas the first 5 were stark, disturbing, and difficult, Episode 6 has exciting scenes inside the Wired, exposition dumps, and the presentation of some surprisingly straightforward plot elements. It's almost like this episode was made for
Kids. Layer 06.
What this episode shows us is that the two sides of Lain, which we saw in the beginning of the show, one which pretends to be ignorant and innocent to an audience of friends and family, and one who is a total hard-ass to an audience of Siberia and the Wired, have at this point gotten so close that we actually see Lain transitioning between them for once. For the first time, we get to witness the physical Lain lapse into her badass persona, both in the flesh and in the Wired. However, as of episode 5, I think it's important to distinguish that the hard-ass Lain, which was originally Lain's persona while using the Wired, is no longer synonymous with Lain of the Wired. At this point, while Lain's harder persona is now more synonymous with her physical form, her Wired form is continuing to morph and take on a life of its own, possibly due to the interference of the Knights. After 5 episodes almost completely lacking in traditional narrative structure, it was downright shocking to see the Knights painted as outright bad guys, experimenting on children and not only betraying but also trying to kill Lain, and doubly so to watch Lain go from the morally ambiguous portrait of mystery to an internet white knight who admonishes the actions of those she deems unjust. All of this is very suspicious given the nature of the series leading up to it, begging the question of whether this is really as cut and dry as it looks, or if we're only seeing it this way because this is how Lain perceives the situation. After all, this episode invites us to a full range of Lain's perspective in a way that no episode until now really has, and almost seems to give us the most pure vision of her character that we've ever gotten. Now, to fit in with the theme of being weirdly unambiguous, allow me to share some info about this project. I first attempted to episodically analyze this series back in 2011 on my anime blog. Even back then, it was a more experimental style of posting with heavy use of art book quotes and images to make my points. However, I only made it up through episode 6, and I didn't even watch the rest of the show at the time. So from here on out, I'll be freshly experiencing the show for the first time in like 7 years, with no idea what kind of analytical points might come up. I'm as in the dark as you are right now, and excited to make the first real progress on this project in its 3 years of running. That's it for Layer 03. Keep an eye out because our next LP is dropping soon.